Hello everyone. Today in my capacity as one of the 3 assistant editors for the RHM Journal, I'm interviewing Jason, Kalin, and David Gruber on their essay titled Gut Rhetorics Towards Experiments in Living with Microbiota. Jason is assistant professor in DePaul University's Department of Writing, Rhetoric, and Discourse, where he researches and teaches rhetorical theory, visual and material rhetorics, digital rhetorics, new media studies, and memory studies, as well as the rhetoric of health and medicine. His work has appeared in International Journal for Scholarship of Teaching and Learning and Visual Communication Quarterly. David is assistant professor in the Department of Media, Cognition, and Communication at the University of Copenhagen. He is co-editor of the forthcoming Routledge Handbook of Language and Science and is working on a monograph titled Brain Art and Neuroscience, Neurosensuality and Effective Realism with Routledge. Thank you so much to both of you for agreeing to do this interview for the journal's website. And I've got questions prepared for you on your excellent essay that I really enjoyed reading. And so I'm really excited to hear sort of some of the back end and some of the other thoughts you have on these issues of gut rhetorics. So the first question I have for you is, your essay foregrounds hard scientific researchers' quote, lack of conceptual resources for studying the millions of non-human bodies and the discursive constructions of what it means to be healthy with a microbiota. You call attention to the, quote, inadequacy of any scientific or epistemic account of how to live within this environment. How does the concept gut rhetorics fill in this conceptual resource gap?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I would say that the term gut rhetorics is only a beginning in coming up with new conceptual resources. I think the idea that there was a conceptual resource gap around this work came out of my experience of seeing no good accounts of how probiotics research was made, or how designations of healthful or unhealthful microbiota were determined, and how they were determined in relationship with patients, through surveys. What exactly was the process going on there? But I also think that maybe the term gut rhetoric is asking us to search for new conceptual resources, in the sense that gut rhetoric itself as a term hopefully does a little bit of work by making more uneasy these distinctions between the brain, gut, the body, and the environment, thinking and emotion, even emotion and affect. And so saying that we need to discover more terms or have more conceptual resources is something that is done in recognition that those dichotomies are increasingly becoming conveniences and mere placeholders.
Wow, that's a great answer.
I would add to that in terms of like this developing conceptual resources, in the sense that one of the things that we were trying to think about is not just like do a rhetoric of microbes or rhetoric of microbiota, but kind of like what could we learn about rhetoric from microbiota and how they are living within the body. And the idea that bacteria are doing, they live in the body in very different kinds of ways than we typically think of. So like the idea that these microbiota are, they go through new generations, much more quickly than we do. So they're constantly evolving, adapting, mutating. They're ingesting other bacteria. They're swapping genes with other bacteria. They're sharing genes with the environment. And so all these different bacteria, bodies, organisms are coming together, and they're being like thrown together, but it doesn't necessarily add up to anything that we would account for as with like scientific epistemic means of like, oh, this is some logical manner of, oh, this is how things are living. And so gut rhetorics is trying to get at that in a little bit and say like, one of the things I think with the term is not so much like, are we getting the representation of the microbiota correct, but like, how do we add to the reality? And that's like the Rhetorian sense of like, how do we assemble these things differently? And so like, how can we think with them? Like gut rhetorics is kind of like trying to, we say at one point, like move beyond representation, but not just to move beyond it because we know, but like, how are these things being thrown together? What can we do with them?
Right.
Live with them. And what does that tell us about rhetoric, if anything?
Right. No, that's great. Those are both really robust answers, and I appreciate that. Okay, good. So the second question I have for you is, your essay advocates for skilled probiotic experimentation. Can you tell us more about that in layman's terms and give us some examples of the kinds of inquiries, practices, and everyday ways of being you'd say align with skilled probiotic experimentation?
Yeah, I think that kind of builds on that, that first response there for the first question, in the sense that what we're seeing with like skilled probiotic experimentation is the sense that, especially in the consumer side of foods and marketing, is that they're not waiting necessarily for all the evidence to be in, because all the evidence will never be in that sense, which is, I guess, the kind of that definition of rhetoric, right? That's why, like, how do we begin? We have to do something, but just not anything. And so that's where the notion, like the skill, comes in. That like, what are the bacteria? What are the materials that we're working with? How do we work with them skillfully? So, like, what would it look like to live skillfully with bacteria, these microbiota? And so that might be like changing your diet, taking the 2-week Dannon activity challenge. Who knows? Does it work? I don't know. But what can you learn from that? And I think that's one of the things that we're trying to think with this kind of skilled probiotic experimentation, is that what consumers are doing with the Activia Dannon challenge is very similar to what the gastroenterologists are asking patients to do anyways in settings. And so what's the difference there? And like, what can we learn just from changing your diet or changing your lifestyle or exercising? And so carrying out these sorts of experiments are a bit maybe more speculative. It's not like necessarily do this or that, but like try this and see what happens. And so like this kind of skillful living is kind of more of like, what can this thing do? What kind of things does it activate or set in motion? And how do we work with them?
Okay, great. And so literally, like, get different probiotics and see how your body reacts with them, and maybe eat more plant-based or whatever, trying to manipulate your own gut bacteria. Like,
yeah, I would say that, yeah, exactly. I think like as like rhetoric scholars, we know consumers are doing this. And so I think David could speak about this a little bit. We know that consumers are doing this. And so one of the responses would be to critique the marketing.
Yeah. Gotcha.
Like, and say, oh, we're just being susceptible to this marketing. Or we could say, well, this is like, no one knows. We're like in this, we don't know how to live, right?
Yeah.
We don't know how to live with microbiota. And so like they're trying something. And is it detrimental to their health? It seems maybe innocuous. So, maybe it's worth a shot. Maybe it's not. Maybe we're still dupes. I don't know.
Okay, yeah, no, well, that's good.
My feeling about it is that I'm prone as a rhetorical critic to want to look at a text or an object and deconstruct it and criticize it and try to show my first reactions to it, to say it's a ideological logic of high capitalism and an extension of the state and a particular form of governance, and being sort of negative about it. And what the idea of skilled experimentation asks me to do as a critic is to try to live with my criticism and think about my own body and be willing to try it out in the process of criticism, a little bit in the same way that an artist walks through a long process in composing an art. So for me, it's a way of becoming more positive, actually, in my research, and not presuming that the negative reading is necessarily going to be the best or only one, that I might see something new if I go and try to live the experience, whether it's experience in the clinic with the patients or experience of actually eating a food. Eating the food's not the point for me. It's the process of trying to live out what we're criticizing. If you're criticizing the far right and Donald Trump, I would think going to a Trump campaign rally would be helpful. And would reveal something new. So it's developing these sort of experiments where you as the critic put your body in a particular situation to rethink something that you have preconceived notions about.
Oh, wow. That's very specific. And both of those examples really help to bring the notion of skilled probiotic experimentations to life, I think, in a way that will really complement your written article really, really well. But I like that idea of it sort of being like suspending disbelief in a way. So great. Okay. So your piece actually offers two really compelling coinages, gut rhetorics as well as skilled probiotic experimentation. As your essay is an attempt to define and carve out space for these two new terms, do you have ideas on how you'd like others to take them up? Or do you know where you'll take this line of inquiry next? And certainly, if you feel like you've given us enough on skilled probiotic experimentation, maybe you want to speak more to gut rhetorics.
Similar to, again, building on that last question and what David was talking about, doing like more creative criticism or going out, I think gut rhetorics and skilled experimentation are both following in what we're seeing with this kind of methodological and method turn within rhetoric and rhetorical theory. I'm trying to think, and like we see this with like rhetorical field methods.
Yeah.
And digital field methods that are trying to get after rhetoric in action or lived or live rhetorics as they're taking place. And so this kind of skillful experimentation, I think, is going along with that a little bit. And so something like that would be, again, kind of living out the criticism. It could be a kind of autoethnography, and where you actually challenge yourself to adopt a sort of diet, and what did you learn from that as like a rhetoric scholar?
That's so cool.
Not critiquing it, but like, I mean, I know like through this process that my diet has changed a little bit over. David and I were working on various versions of this paper and thinking about it for a long time. It's like, oh, maybe I should drink more yogurt or something like that. And so, like, how does that actually begin to change? The kind of thoughts that you have, I guess, in that sense.
Right.
And so it becomes that process. And so I think I see it fitting within this and this whole kind of methodological development that, new materialisms, object ontologies, ecological thought, it doesn't really tell you how to do anything, right? It doesn't actually how to study stuff. So you need to develop methods to actually kind of try to not so much capture, but to make these relations real.
Yeah. Wow, that's really well said, Jason. I love that. I love the idea of autoethnographic work with gut rhetorics. That's really cool.
We'll see.
Kalin is quite articulate.
Yeah, that was really good. I liked it.
I'll add just one philosophical thought of where I'd like to see more work in the area, and then maybe one concrete area I'm studying as an extension of the paper.
Okay.
But in the philosophical sense, I think that gut rhetorics is contributing. One way to say it would be to spreading out the ground of groundlessness for self and cognition by tying us more fully to non-human materialities and this sort of soupy miasma of psychedelic chemicals we're living in that emanate
wow.
chlorine, nitrogen, and bacterial strains, and there's all kinds of new terminology in this world of gastroenterology that might be useful for rhetorical criticism. Things like deleterious exclusions and copiotrophs and the way the enzymes live. And I mean, there's all kinds of things we can do there to help us theorize this strange condition we have where we are living with non-human things that are uninterested in our humanness and in the preservation of it.
Wow.
And in fact, gut rhetorics in that sense reintroduces violence and hiddenness into the idea of rhetoric. I mean, in some ways, it's a recuperation of death and intrarelationality. If intrarelationality is hyper-focused on coming into beings and emergences, then gut rhetoric says, well, we have these things that are required to die in order to bring about emergences and that are agonistic to our living. So I would like to see more work that explores that and thinks about the importance of that aspect of gut bacteria. But concretely, I'm really interested in these surveys that are being used to help compose affect states and how different they can be. So I'm digging into those a little bit more with Jason in a follow-up paper that we're still exploring where it might go.
Wow.
David, this is a side note, so maybe cut this out. But David, have you taken the surveys? the questionnaires?
Yes, but since those are highly about stress, anxiety, and depression, I think I'll keep the results to myself.
Okay.
Fair enough. Wow. Well,
But
David,
that's a great. That question is on point for
because that like goes to our point. It was like it's not enough. It's just not enough to critique the questionnaires that they're using. But like, what if you took them themselves, or if you went through the process yourself to see, and then become a patient in the experiment that the gastroenterologists are doing? Would be interesting.
Wow. That was incredibly eloquent, David. You two are blowing me away with these answers. So either
we spent 2 or 3 years thinking about this, me and Jason having multiple conversations. So we have every conference that we've seen each other at for the last 3 years, we've talked about this paper.
Wow.
It was just ideas at first, and these ideas went all over the place. So
no, that's really cool. I think especially for people like contemplating the value of co-authoring and collaboration, that like hearing that it took 3 years of conversations to culminate in something that's of this caliber of thought and articulation I think is good for people to hear. So that's
Thank you.
So, okay, so the next question I have for you two is, in your essay, you use rhetorical ontological inquiry adapted from, among other places, S. Scott Graham's work, and specifically work with the concept of calibration. You pair that methodological focus with a phenomenological one. For readers who are unfamiliar with this method, can you offer advice for the others who might want to adapt these methodologies? Because it is abstract, right? The idea of rhetorical ontological inquiry is quite abstract, and I think you do a good job of using it. So what would be your your guide for people who are new to it?
Yeah, I think one of the really productive things that Scott did in his work is trying to develop this methodology of trying to think through what does it mean to study material rhetoric? What does it mean to study new materialisms and object-oriented ontologies that are trying to do away what he calls the two-world problem? Subject objects. Like, how do you get beyond that, or how do you think about that differently, as he says? And so he's trying to bring rhetoric, which has traditionally focused on the discourse, the discursive aspects, and the ontological. So rhetorical ontological inquiry becomes a methodology, becomes an approach, a theoretical orientation to trying to study like ontological multiplicity, how are things created through doings and practices, and then ecological entanglement, how are things just their relations, how are they created through relations. And so by bringing the rhetorical and ontological together, he's trying to do both of those things at the same time, and saying that rhetoric and ontology, epistemology, ontology, phenomenology, as we say, are inseparable, but also irreducible to one another. And so how can you study these things? And so as a methodology, it's like this conceptual theoretical approach. As a method, you still don't really know what to do. But he's an ethnographer. And so he goes into different discourse communities and studies pain and how it's talked about. Among medical, psychiatric, pharmaceutical, patient self-reporting, feeling, and so he talks about how he's that kind of ethnographer. So he uses the methods of ethnography to do that. Looking at, again, it's kind of rhetorical field methods of like looking at lived practices in the field. And I guess one of the things that we were trying to do is maybe lead into the phenomenology a little bit more and say, what does it feel like to live with microbiota? And so what would be the appropriate methods for doing that? And so there, I think, is where we shift and try to introduce this kind of skilled probiotic experimentation. Like what are the methods that would be suitable or appropriate, or could allow you to bring these things into presence in a way that you couldn't have otherwise?
So do you think, Jason, that autoethnography is one of the methods that fit?
I think for me, probably, I think it's one of the things that fit, because if phenomenology is kind of that feeling. So I mean, you'd have to autoethnography allows you to get into that. At the same time, it's limited because you're limiting it to your own experiences. And so I think one of the thing that David wants think about is, how do you set experiments doing rhetoric that would get at like phenomenological experience through experiments.
Okay, interesting.
Like how could rhetoric scholars set up experiments to get at phenomenology?
I like that.
Am I getting that right, David?
Absolutely. I love experimentation and the idea of experimentation, other than a particular form of experimentation. Yeah, I think Jason summed it up in that comment, trying to lead with phenomenology instead of just seeing it as one piece that's maybe been more devalued in rhetorical scholarship. We're just privileging it a little bit more.
Okay, I like that. I think that's a really nice distinction. Good. Okay, so your piece takes up the connection between microbiota and emotions. Are there examples of this connection that don't make it into your essay? What is the current popular wisdom on the connection between the content of one's gut and their mental health status? And how do gut rhetorics extend, complicate, or challenge that connection?
I think maybe I'll pick up on the idea of current wisdom and where we might go with that.
Okay, cool.
I think that maybe my feeling is, by reading through a lot of this literature, and I'm not going to pretend to be a gastroenterologist here, but I think that the current wisdom is suggesting that the gut and the brain are interconnected more than we realize. Some articles even suggest that the gut is like a second brain, because it's connected to the brain through the spine, the vagus nerve, the bloodstream. There's efferent signals. There's chemicals going back and forth. The brain might grow in some regions better as a result of certain microbiomes than others. So outside of any of the details there, I think that gut rhetorics you asked whether it can extend or complicate something in this literature. I would just like to see more thinking about the body as a thing that becomes brainy because of the environment. Another way to say this might be that we are privileging emotional relations that are environmental relations.
Interesting. Okay. No, that's very clear, actually. I like that.
Kalin, what do you want to add to that?
Thinking about that, we cite at one time Elizabeth Wilson in her book Gut Feminism, and she said something like the gut. She's not making the argument that not that the gut contributes to minded states, but that the gut is an organ of mind. And so we're thinking through our entire body here, and to have thinking at the question like the connection between microbiota and emotions. That presumes that that's kind of setting up that there's microbiota and then there are emotions and that they're somehow connected to one another. But that question, it's not like we're not trying to connect the dots, but in a new materialist approach is how are these things just their relations? How are they interacting, right? And so they're bringing each other into being. So it might not be the case that you have an emotion, but it's like the microbiota and emotion are tied up into one another. And so the kinds of emotions that you have might somehow influence the kind of microbiota you have. And the kind of microbiota you have might influence the kind of emotions you have. So what do you do with that? And so this kind of, it's not just these things like microbiota and emotion. They're just not things to be studied. Like you just don't study microbiota. You just don't study affect states or emotions. They're actually things to live with too. And so how do you live with them? That when they say, I think Thomas Rickert talks about this in Ambient Rhetoric, but when you are depressed, the whole world appears colored by that depression, right? And so in the same kind of way, it might be the case that your whole body is conditioned by the microbiota to experience certain things.
Wow. Okay.
So what do you do? Again, where do you go from there? How do you make? If that's the case, then how do you actually treat someone with depression?
Right. Wow. Okay. No, that's a great answer. Because then it insinuates that you could do those skilled probiotic experimentations in an attempt to have some impact on your affect states. So
and it was thinking about it, and it seems like if you're not eating a healthy diet, all of a sudden then you're the cause. You're something that's wrong with you. You're not doing something right. And so I think that's maybe one where we have to be careful about, like kind of skilled probiotic experimentation, in the sense that if you're not doing these things, then somehow you're not living correctly.
Right,
And that's,
you're to blame.
People want to imply that either, right?
Right, of course not.
That's often what happens. Like, you're just not throwing it back on the individual.
Right.
I don't want to do that either, right?
I think that to build on that, Jason, I think that gut rhetorics can also really complicate those popular. By calling something gut rhetorics, we're not highlighting for celebration the popular rhetoric of the gut that's selling us probiotics.
Okay.
But we're highlighting the living with the gut, so studying that, but also turning it back around to live it out. But what I'm trying to say here is that the popular rhetorics of probiotics will say something like, buy this, eat that, feel great.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that by living with probiotics, you actually really complicate that narrative. To think about how you do feel differently, if you do at all, if it's even detectable or discernible. And then thinking about your larger environments and the discourses of your region and how all of these things are blending together. I'll stop there so I don't ramble, but
no, it's good.
My point is that Jason, was trying to say we're not encouraging necessarily an ethical impetus for individuals to go out and therefore you have to go buy probiotics because it's the right thing to do. We're actually trying to rather complicate that narrative.
Okay, yeah, very good. Okay, so last question, and I think that actually in your response to the previous question, you sort of addressed this a bit, but I'm very intrigued by your suggestion that gut rhetorics suggest an approach that investigates what does not line up or feel quite right. And can you say any more about this idea? In terms of what you've said before, of course, I think it fits quite well, but so gut rhetoric suggests an approach to investigating what does not line up or feel quite right. Do you want to say more?
Because that was the beginning of the paper. Actually, that was the core idea from the get-go.
Okay, cool.
Was the idea of exclusion as a complement to attunement.
Okay. Huh.
My feeling was that rhetoric is focused a lot on coming togethers or on attunements. And fair enough. I mean, there's lots of reasons for that. One of which is because maybe when we look at human and non-human networks, we look for the salient relations of things that are coming together as opposed to the things that are pushing away or falling apart, excluding or dying.
Mm-hmm.
So we wanted to say something about that. And gut rhetoric seemed particularly useful, especially because when we started to look at the cases, we realized that the arguments in the particular probiotics case studies that we talk about in the paper, the arguments are based on saying that certain probiotics engage in a competitive exclusion of pro-inflammatory elements in the body, which cause inflammation. And so we took a methodology that followed in kind, which is we looked at the gaps between the studies or across studies that were being interrelated as support for the probiotic. So how they didn't line up.
Okay.
We were looking at the ways the surveys were different, the way that the participants were asked to do different things, the different times that the participants had to engage in these probiotics. So we took not only the idea of exclusion as inspiration from the get-go, but then we found it in the text, and then we used that to drive the way in which we talked about the different studies.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, and I to frame that differently would be that like the body and microbiota, they've been evolving together for millions of years, but they're also evolving, like microbiota also evolving for life within the body.
Mm-hmm.
So they're both creating the body and adapting within it in that kind of way. But it's an agonistic. It's definitely an agonistic relationship. Mm-hmm. Studies suggest that the presence of this microbiota might cause low-level inflammation that instigates the immune system, right? Mm-hmm. Which can be a good thing. but too much, or those microbiota in the wrong locations in the body, and they're no longer beneficial, right?
Right.
That there's in some sense that these microbiota are trying to eat you.
Exactly.
And so the body actually devises, tries to keep them at bay at the same time. So the mucous membrane, the epithelial skin between the intestines, kind of keep the microbiota in their place, wherever that place is. At the same time, there's the immune system might be sending out cells to kind of check in on these, and are these friendly, are they not? And so it's creating these kind of inflammatory responses within the body. And so it's definitely an agonistic relationship, and it's not about how all these things are coming together or lining up, and so it's about all these other things that are happening too. And so what does that, again, to come back to the idea, like what can we learn about rhetoric from that experience?
Right. I think it's really such a cool concept to think about rhetoric through these sort of unpredictable bodily phenomena. And I'm thinking, just as you're talking about like ulcerative colitis and other autoimmune gut inflammatory bowel conditions.
Yeah.
And what they have to do with that delicate balance maybe being tipped off in some way. Well, these were amazing answers. So I have a gastroenterology question for you guys. Have you ever heard of H. pylori, this bacteria?
Yes.
Okay, I think that's such an interesting thing, and I hope rhetoricians take it on at some point, and I wonder if it's you guys, so I just throw it out there for you. So
why don't you?
Maybe I will. And guess what? I definitely would be citing gut rhetorics, because conceptually it's just incredibly rich. And I think that the nice thing about your essay is that it offers a way of thinking about how to do rhetoric health medicine research that is incredibly generative. And so the coinages are actually some of the most helpful parts of the essay. And I guess you probably meant it that way. Like, it's making a real contribution methodologically. So I really appreciate your work, and I'm excited for it to get out there in the world. And I do think that the interview will be a nice sort of complement to it as people think through ways that they can be citing and using this work as a jumping off point for their own inquiries. So thanks for your great contribution to the journal, and it was great talking with you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.